that and all the rest of it.
Right.
You're up for that. You're up for that. That's the side of it that you will go.
Right, there's people are sat right in England right now in flats across this country, whether it be Glasgow, Manchester, Birmingham, London, Leeds, Liverpool, Sheffield, in rooms like this, and they've all got the drugs out. That's no fucking. That is no big. That is a part of life.
Exactly.
That is
up, man.
I'm not talking about that.
I'm just contradicting yourself. You ain't got a clue.
You've got
too many fucking
drinks,
right?
I'm
the
not.
thing is, I don't want to be classed. I don't want to go out of my way to go. I'm this. I'm an hard fucker. And I'm this. I'm in a band to make fucking music, but that thing will come along with it. It always does.
The Who hated each other and all.
Yeah, well, I hate this bastard.
Is that important to you? Is that what fires this band up?
And that's what it's all about. That's why we'll be the best band in the world, because I fucking hate that swat there.
Same goes for you.
Sitting there, man. He despise.
The Who used to go on about how much they fucking hated each other.
Yeah, well, I fucking hate him. And I hope one day there's a release where I can smash fuck out of him with a fucking Rickenbacker right on his nose. And then he does it same to me, because I think that we're stepping right up to it now. There's a fucking line there and we're right on the edge of it. And one day it's just going to go.
Here, Noel Gallagher has announced he's quitting the band Oasis. He says he can no longer work with his brother Liam.
It kind of all started to unravel, if I'm being honest, when he started his clothing label.
Do with personalities, you know what I mean? And I didn't spit, I didn't do a walkies, Noel did, you know what I mean? So you'd have to ask him.
And in his own head, he thinks that I'm some kind of fucking puppet master who controls the media in England.
Recently, their disagreements have become more public.
You know, it's a bit like WWE wrestling, and he was like the macho man Randy Savage, do you know what I mean?
Apparently I was a nightmare to work with, apparently I had my own dressing rooms and stuff like that. I don't think so, mate. I was with the band all the time.
On the Saturday, they both went to the Manchester City game, were at different ends of the ground, and then got separate cars to the gig, and eventually met up when they walked on stage.
Maybe it wasn't as explosive an event back there in that dressing room as the reality.
No, it wasn't. Not in my books, it wasn't.
He came back with a guitar and started wielding it like an axe, and I'm not fucking kidding.
That's like an old Beatles thing that I got inspired by, like Ringo used to wear them.
And I'm looking at Andy, who's sat there, constantly counting how many shoes he's got on, not saying a word.
Probably got a batch of songs that he doesn't want his brother singing or whatever, and he wants to go down another road.
And without him, it's hard to imagine the band continuing.
So I was like, you know what, I'm fucking out of here, you know. And at that point, the tour manager came in and just went, 5 minutes.
It's for you people on our back, people that can't see, fuck all.
Now thousands of pop fans are glued to their CD players with the latest Oasis album today.
In the past 2 years, the most successful British pop group of recent times.
I subscribe to the Umberto Eco view that Liam's a town crier and Noel's a poet.
We had a good drink on the plane, it's safe to say.
Greatest band of the world? Now, after the Beatles.
The supergroup Oasis is apparently on the verge of breaking up.
It's the way I feel about you now.
Why didn't somebody fucking stop me at that point and say, look,
the whole that they're on about, it's like referring to Bernie's where we live.
Oasis fans with tickets just can't be there now. Do you know what I mean?
You got shit questions here, man.
He's the boy, that Noel. Same with his Bing Crosby hat there as well. But
oh no, that one's Liam.
Hey, people didn't know, no.
How many people now? What sort of things do you know about?
Everything.
I'm afraid the rest is down in celluloid TV history, I'm afraid.
Turn your pages to 1993 and people are pretty excited about British music. There's a whole scene of youthful, fresh and vibrant bands milling about, the likes of Blur, Suede, the Boo Radleys, the Manic Street Preachers, Pulp, The Verve and many others. Britpop was the culmination and amalgamation of all that had come before it, everything from the shoegazer and Manchester movements that preceded it, all the way back to the peak of psychedelia in the 1960s came together for this party. And the capital was its epicentre, specifically Camden, where many of these bands pitched their tents, existing on a diet of skunk and Dr. Martens. Magazines like Q, Select, Melody Maker, and of course The NME, Britain's weekly music newspaper, had no end of new music to cover as a result. It was a pretty glorious time for those people. And all too soon for them, it was to be ruined.
With pop as your vehicle, you can speak to the nation, for that is your purpose.
The origins of the nuclear bomb that would ultimately blast Britpop away came in 1991, with a young and fresh-faced band called Lorraine from Manchester, consisting of Paul McGuigan, Paul Arthurs, Tony McCarroll, and, on vocals, Chris Hutton. Chris wouldn't ever play a gig with them. He was gone quickly and replaced by a mouthy 18-year-old lad by the name of Liam Gallagher. The name, inspired by a Beatles song that would pretty much become the template for the sound of the mid-90s, also went. Liam suggested a new name that he'd seen on an In Spiral Carpets tour poster. It so happened that they'd played at the Oasis Leisure Centre.
So I got into music when I was about 18 or something, 17. And I thought, I could do that. I could do that well easy, you know what I mean? It was just a matter of time of getting the right people around, you know what I mean?
They made a racket on their first gig at the Boardwalk in Manchester, which so happened to be attended by Liam's brother Noel, a roadie for the In Spiral Carpets who had a fair few songs in his locker and wanted an outlet for them. And so he agreed to join. And from there the grind began. Get in the van, get your cans and pouches out, get writing, get gigging, and try to get noticed. And eventually they were.
Because we were and we knew that we wouldn't get any better unless we had his songs, you know what I mean? And his guitar playing and stuff, you know. You just have to make him feel really important and go, please, Noel, please join us. We are not worthy, you know what I mean? And then he'd sort of like come round.
When Oasis made their big arrival onto the indie mainstream in 1994, signed to the prestigious label Creation after virtually barging into a gig uninvited and taking the stage with their often outrageous rockstar antics and straightforward full-on 4/4 rock tunes, frankly a lot of the music press had no idea what to do with them. They weren't just different from the bands the music press loved, they seemed to be against them. Oasis themselves never identified with the term Britpop, nor were they ever really a part of Britpop's inner circle, at least not until they became the circle. And then there's the attitude. Right from the early interviews, they said that they were going to be the best and biggest band in the world, and seemed to firmly believe it. The twee student nature of Blur, the glam heroin cheek of Suede, the navel-gazing antics of all those grunge groups in America? Not for them.
A song that comes along which goes, girls who like boys who dig girls who like boys who dig girls who like boys who love girls who like boys who dig girls who like boys who love girls who like boys, always need to love someone. No. That appeals to the mentality of a human being, and that's sad. Girls who dig boys who love girls who love boys who love girls who dig boys.
They were rock stars, at a time when being a rock star was about as fashionable as being David Essex. Getting into fights, drinking, snorting, smoking, getting chucked off ferries, throwing TVs out of windows. Yep, that's Oasis. Almost from the off, as much reporting was done about their antics as there was about their music.
Bit of blood everywhere, so we just started took the guitar.
Was he just overexcited, or had you done something to him?
No, maybe it's just because he thinks he's hard, he thinks we're up for the fight and that.
Right.
He thought, yeah, I'll have this.
Well, it's actually because he found out I was sleeping with his girlfriend.
Really?
Yeah.
Was it?
Yeah.
Nice one.
1 week Noel's quit the band, the next he's back in and saying that the next album's going to knock the fuck out of whatever other shite's coming out, and that he'll also knock the fuck out of our kid, that being his kid brother. The most interesting thing about Oasis has always been the relationship between Noel and Liam. The line from the start of this video comes from a famous interview that they gave in 1994, which devolved into a heated argument over music versus image, with Noel representing the former and Liam the latter. As you probably know, they don't like each other very much, but it's not like they ever tried to hide that at any point. One of the best things about listening to Oasis is how their brand of brotherly love comes out in their music. Even people who don't like their music can recognise that Noel, certainly in the early days of the band, has got something. He knows how to write a riff, and then he can build on that with solos, layers of guitar, the odd little effect here and there, nods to his own cornerstones of music, Beatles, Stones, Who, Weller, thus creating Oasis's signature wall of sound. Phil Spector but with bucket hats and 504s, shoegaze but with rock riffs and attitude. Combine that with what was in the early days a pretty good knack for the lyric, and you've got a pretty talented guy.
I'm either going to go and work in the local factory, be a drug dealer, or, you know, see if I can do anything with this guitar, eh? So I decided if I was going to make anything of my entire life, that was going to be it.
And then you've got Liam. Liam has no time for Noel's carefully built up layers of guitars, sound effects and tributes to dead idols. He barely has any time for lyrics. Another singer, most other singers, would try their best to match Noel's wall and probably strain their vocal cords doing it. Liam doesn't even care to try, preferring instead to virtually throw out the lyrics with a distinct, almost chucked off Mancunian twang that's somewhere between Johnny Rotten and Marquis Smith. It's barely sinning. Just hear the difference between an Oasis song that's sung by Liam and one sung by Noel himself. He didn't have much time for Noel on stage either, almost trolling Noel's efforts by simply standing there, barely shaking a tambourine, head tilted up Lemmy style and getting the words out. Oh, and occasionally throwing said tambourine Noel's way mid-solo if he'd had a few, thus causing Noel to quit the band for the 3rd time that month.
If you tell Liam not to put his head in the fire, then he will. You can't even agree to disagree. If you advise him not to do something, then he's going to go and do it. So, you just got to let him go on with it.
I come first before any get out of the garden.
And so you get the yin and yang of Oasis. Noel, the student of the game, he who's taken all the influence and made something good that's his own, the introspective songwriter and driving musical force. And Liam, the piss-taking and occasionally volatile frontman who didn't give a shit about any of that, and gives the band a sense that anything, and I do mean anything, could happen. Without either of them, the band simply ceases to exist.
I'm not into slapping anyone around, but it's like there's days when I've needed a slap and he's slapped me, and there's days when he's needed a slap, so I've slapped him. I went on a big fight, we hadn't talked for about 2 months, you know, I'm going like that. Just like that. And then just sort of like grown up one day. I went, nah, I've got to start talking. I mean, in a band, it's not right for all the other people in the band.
Did it work? Fuck yeah, it did. Especially early on. The Oasis that burst onto the scene in 1994 had attitude and were leery as all get out, but they also had the tunes, the hunger, and the sheer energy. Their debut single, Supersonic, remains one of their best. Any further misgivings were laid to rest when their debut album, Definitely Maybe, hit. It's a classic, frankly. Songs like Live Forever, Columbia, Slide Away, and the opening mission statement, Rock and Roll Star, are classics almost 25 years later, but they were even more electric at the time. Even their singles were filled with B-sides that most bands would have been happy to release as their lead singles, something that would become even more ridiculous on the next record. The record was critically acclaimed and very popular, and it was clear immediately that Oasis had hit on something. The oil was squirting out pretty freely. And still, they were a problem for some. If anything, they were an even bigger problem. One that wasn't likely to simply go away in a series of flicked Vs, press sprawls and live mic F-bombs.
You're being hyped as the best band around at the moment. Is all the hype true?
Yeah.
It is. Good.
The best band about today on the planet. It's a fact.
Despite the first album's success, Oasis are still not exactly welcomed into the fold of Britpop. Nor do they care to be, and already battle lines are being drawn, in particular between them and the biggest Britpop band of them all, Blur. Oasis and Blur may share a fair bit of musical DNA, but in other areas, especially image, they couldn't be more different. There's a strand of American college rock, nods towards more progressive or new wavy genres, and the trappings of student life, things that are all utterly hoam to Oasis.
I'd like to thank all the people. All the people. So many people. And they walk your hands in hands through their shite life.
By and large, the press knew who they preferred, and it wasn't the knuckle-down blokes from Manchester, it was the modern dandies from London who'd met at Goldsmiths College. It's so easy to simplify the Blur and Oasis rivalry in many ways. Automatically you're doing it simply by restricting it to these two bands. You're also simplifying it by purely concentrating on the differences in their music. You're even simplifying it if you directly relate it to those oh-so-British issues, that of class and the regional divide. The media certainly made the most of that. Oasis were working-class lads with shit childhoods from a shit suburb of Manchester, and Blur were presented as middle-class Londoners with nice childhoods who went to college. While Oasis's presentation is pretty near the mark, Blur's doesn't do them much justice at all, as they came from a variety of backgrounds, from admitted suburban bliss to, in the case of Graham, the army barracks.
We felt that we've paid our dues a bit, and you know, it's just up to us to sort of follow up.
Not that it mattered. Lord knows the north-south divide would be played up enough, especially when the rivalry came to a head. The rivalry was more based around what was in and abiding by the rules of the mainstream music press. Essentially, it was about playing the game. Blur were much more in step with the music press of the time, who found their work a lot more interesting than Oasis's, which seemed more like this energetic but still reactionary throwback, even if both bands owed a pretty significant debt to that which came before. Oasis were not in step, called themselves the best band in the world, and were more than happy to give their opinions on bands like Blur, who were indie darlings and had been around that little bit longer. Blur felt like they'd earned a place as the scene's leaders and were already on the road towards their fourth album, while Oasis were the usurpers who didn't want to wait.
We want to be the biggest band in the world, and we're going to do it, and that, don't be jealous of us.
We've just got a different way of presenting ourselves. Liam likes to be more in your face than I do. But I'm hard.
It's like how they managed to get signed to Creation in the first place. If you won't let us in, then we'll basically barge in by force. Now, this isn't to say that there's some great conspiracy against Oasis or anything like that to put them down. Even if there was, it wouldn't have been effective. It's merely that the music press, the tastemakers and the like, well, a lot of them weren't necessarily fans, and while pretty much everyone, including them, stood up to appreciate Definitely Maybe, it was clear that this album was the Oasis blueprint going forward, now and forevermore. A sound to take over the world with, and not necessarily one that the press were always going to like. Naturally, they would champion alternatives. And with good cause too. Right here, in late 1994, the stakes were higher than ever. Vacancies existed in the upper high echelons of British music. With the old guard, well, getting old, new faces were needed at the very top to be Britain's representatives to the planet. Back in the time when radio was so much bigger than it is now, change was also happening at one of the top stations in the country, BBC Radio 1. Billed as the station for new and popular music, the audience for Radio 1 had gotten older as the bands and DJs did, and it was out of touch. New controller Matthew Bannister made sweeping changes, replacing the station's establishment with promising young DJs, and promising to play music that actually mattered to the youth of the day. Basically, Britpop.
Within months, self-styled medallion man Gary Davis, Whispering Bob Harris, Alan Freeman, Jackie Brambles and Johnny Walker had all been Bannistered.
They were just dismissed as if they were nothing, as if there was something on the bottom of your shoe. We just thought, who's next? And every day somebody was getting fired. It was very, very ugly.
The changes didn't help at first. The old DJs who had been replaced took their old audiences elsewhere, and it took a while for the young uns to replace them. But eventually, the summer of 1995 happened, and Britpop finally paid off on its commercial promise. Classic after classic. hit after hit. And nothing defined that more than the greatest chart war in UK history. The two biggest bands releasing a single on the same day and firmly drawing battle lines. Very public spats between the frontmen of each band, Damon and Liam on a party for Oasis's first #1, some might say in April, brought the rivalry out in the open, and then all of a sudden the lead-in singles for both bands' next albums, Oasis's Roll With It and Blur's Country House, are scheduled for release on the 14th of August 1995.
Two of Britain's most popular pop groups have begun the biggest chart war in 30 years. The Manchester band Oasis and their arch rivals Blur released new singles today, each hoping to reach the #1 spot next week.
It would usually make more sense for such things to be staggered so that both bands could have a #1, and usually there would be correspondence to make sure that happened. But spurred on by personal rivalry between the frontmen, eager management companies, and despite a reluctance from other people such as Creation boss Alan McGee and Blur guitarist Graham Coxon, both bands refused to blink and the war was on. While Roll With It led in sales early on in the week, Blur ultimately prevailed by Sunday, winning the battle with 274,000 sales to Oasis's 216k. It goes without saying that in most people's eyes, neither song is the finest example of the band's work. Roll With It is a very typical Oasis song, to the point where you can predict the layers of guitar coming into the millisecond, and Liam's elongating of his vowels start to reach parody levels. And Country House has something of an ironic smug streak that Blur didn't usually have, Ray Davies songwriting but with a lot less charm. It didn't matter, as this was the most successful week in the UK charts for a whole decade, and the mainstream press lapped up every bit of it, from the initial fight to the silly excuses afterwards, such as a reported problem with the barcode on Oasis's single that nobody, including those who spread that rumour, really believed. It's often said, once again subtly building up Oasis's class underdog label, that Blur obviously won because they were signed to Food, who were owned by Parlophone, who were owned by major label EMI. Obviously Oasis, signed to an indie label like Creation, couldn't match Blur's major label backed distribution. A pretty story, Liz. That is if you ignore the fact that Creation were at this point owned by Sony. Even by 1995, you don't get as far as Oasis had gotten up to this point without major label backing. In both bands' camps, reaction was mixed. The management and Damon were pretty pleased and had a piss-up to celebrate, during which Graham Coxon, who was against the whole war from the off, only half-jokingly threatened to jump out of a multi-storey window to escape the madness. Oasis had a piss-up too, although they would have probably had that whether they'd won or lost. Rhythm guitarist Paul Arthurs, who was by now only known by the nickname Bonehead, said that he didn't care if they got to #2 or 102, Blur can get on with their music, and we'll get on with ours. Noel, if anyone, took the whole thing most to heart, infamously saying in September that he hoped that Blur bassist Alex James and Damon Albarn got AIDS and died, creating more controversy and ultimately forcing a public apology.
Because we're still sat here, how many years now, still talking about the Blur and Oasis thing, and you know what annoys me the most about it all? It's Blur and Oasis. Why do their name get put first? It's fucking Oasis and Blur, for fuck's sake. But, you know, hats off to him for that.
As for Liam, I mean, you'd probably expect him to be the shoutiest, wouldn't you? Well, mere weeks later he ran into Alex, by far the poshest member of Blur and the most party-loving, in a pub. They had some quick semi-serious banter about the whole thing, before immediately uniting over a shared love of Bolivian marching powder. Never let bitter rivalries or supposed class boundaries get in the way of something that's white and expensive.
It was all good fun, wasn't it?
As it turned out, it was more important for Blur to beat Oasis than it was for Oasis to beat Blur. Blur's aims were different, and they were never aiming for the sort of world domination that by now Oasis clearly wanted. Even if they had wanted it, they were far too esoteric for it. Because of this, nailed-on hit singles like Country House don't always come around. Even if it's not their best song, it's a fair bit more commercial than most of their work, and giving Oasis a bloody nose not only allowed them to retain credibility and be the example of just how successful Britpop could be in the mainstream, it helped cement their legacy, finally giving them the #1 that they needed. Oasis, on the other hand, well, losing didn't really affect them much. Sure, they wanted #1s like anyone else, but their plans were altogether much greater than the UK charts, and that would become ever clearer as their second album rolled into view. Now by this point I'm sure you're wondering, when exactly are we going to get to the mooted subject of this whole video, that big old 1997 homage to excessive coke intake and rock excess that apparently killed Britpop as a whole? Well, sorry, but none of that story makes sense without all of this build-up. Sure, you all know what's the story Morning Glory and how successful it was, but what about how much the critics actively shat on it? There's a marked difference between the first and the second record. It's altogether slicker. Not in a complete sellout way, but more like the difference between Nirvana's Bleach and Nevermind.
People think we've been going like 10 years or something. We've only actually been putting records. Definitely maybe only came out like last August. It's what people don't realise, and it's like, it's only a second album. They say, have you changed over the last 3 years? I'd say, yeah, because we didn't have a record deal 3 years ago.
Better songs, we're all playing better. You know what I mean? We know about the studio and that now, you know what I mean? First song we didn't know anything about.
Whereas Definitely Maybe is pretty much all-out attack, Morning Glory features a lot of the same, but is then happy to quieten everything down, pick up the acoustic guitars and strings, and invite you to get the lighters out. Its themes are a great deal more universal, and all the good things about the band are amplified with some of the rougher edges hidden. In short, it's a record that is utterly geared for world domination. And the UK critics of the time? They didn't really like it. Some, in particular Q and Melody Maker, savaged it and said they sounded knackered. Oasis weren't going in the direction they wanted. No experimentation, more professionalism. Not really artistic growth. They went at them for it, and in doing so, they found themselves completely out of step with public opinion.
Why can you remember some of the words tonight?
Too pissed up, and I'm not even rehearsing anything, and I think it's a top album, and all like, yeah, top can. Not like fucking Enemy slagged it off, and all like, fair enough, it's not about that. Kids, mate, kids decide, don't they?
Definitely Maybe may have been one of the fastest selling albums in the history of the UK charts, but Morning Glory eclipsed it, selling 374,000 copies in its first week alone, and eventually becoming one of the best-selling UK albums of all time. It sold millions in America, breaking them over there too. To date, the record has sold over 22 million copies. Blur won the Battle of Britpop, sure, but Oasis won the war. They said that they were going to be the biggest band in the world, and now, well, basically they were.
I don't walk around with a velvet waistcoat on with the diagram of the universe on the back of it, with a joss stick hanging out my nostril going, oh wow man, a hole in my shoe and all that, you know, launching, you know, got like a rocket launcher in the back garden that rocket launches tellies up the street.
It's been a naughty boy, hasn't he?
Is it tough? Yeah, it can be, sometimes it is. It's tough being a City fan.
Everyone points to one event in particular as Oasis's coronation moment, their absolute zenith, the 10th and the 11th of August 1996, Knebworth. 2 nights featuring plenty huge bands and Oasis as headliners in a field that 250,000 people would stomp over. A staggering 2.6 million people applied for tickets to the 2 shows, which was at the time the single largest demand for concert tickets in UK history, eclipsed only by the 2007 Armaturtigun tribute concert that was headlined by a one-night-only reunion of Led Zeppelin. This was Oasis's high watermark, and indeed the high watermark of Britpop itself as a commercial force, a triumph for the conquering horde. A celebration of Oasis officially being the biggest band in the world.
Did you ever think it was going to get this big?
Be a liar if I said, yeah. Liam would probably say, I thought it was going to be bigger than that. But I didn't think it was going to get this big. Nobody thought that one day we'd have sold 10 million albums and we'd been playing to 250,000 people over 2 days. Anyone that said that they did believe that's a liar.
It would never get this good again. It literally took about 2 weeks for the cracks to really show, when a recording for MTV Unplugged ended up just being Noel on his own after Liam pulled out citing a sore throat, and then turned up to heckle his brother in between songs. It's a funny gig, but the tension is palpable.
An hour before we were due to go on, he turned up absolutely shit-faced.
Good morning, butterfly.
I said, well, look, let's see if you can sing a couple of songs, and it was just dreadful.
By this stage, Liam and Noel were on the tabloid front pages virtually every day with reports of more bust-ups, or drunken nights out, or various other instances of bad behaviour, or rows with Patsy Kensit or Meg Matthews and all that other shit. Another public bust-up happened at the MTV Video Music Awards. Fun to watch, isn't it? Noel and the rest of the band flew home on separate planes, leading to speculation that Oasis had actually split. And in fact, they had. Hardly the first breakup, but the most serious one yet, and it took a few weeks for a truce to be called and the brothers to reconcile.
News that the band might be splitting up provoked mixed reactions.
I hate Oasis.
Why do you hate Oasis?
Because their music is crap. If they split up, it's going to cause it'd be worse than Take That when Take That split up.
Wind up for you.
Their brother warned against reading too much into news that they'd had a fight last night.
They always have arguments, you know what I mean? So I wouldn't look into it too much. They had an argument in Los Angeles about 2 years ago where Noel went on a bit of a bender. I didn't split up then. I just waited for him to come back.
Crazy times indeed for the world's biggest band. Everyone was looking to them, and not just their fans. Hell, it had gotten to the point where some people were looking at them to help them get into power. So, really? Oasis as potential kinmakers? Well, with a general election on the horizon in 1997 and a stale, corpulent Conservative Party on the throne, Tony Blair's new Labour, a somewhat bastardised version of the original, was set to take control, with really the only question being by how much. Blair's Labour had the great advantage of a relatively young leader at the helm, and they tried to attach themselves to what by now was known as Cool Britannia, which not only included Britpop but also a whole load of other things: the success of the young British artists, fashion dons like Alexander McQueen, the Spice Girls and the girl power movement, films like Trainspotting, UK's awesome dance scene at the time in clubs like the Ministry of Sound, and the football team's great success in reaching the semi-finals of Euro 96. Labour helped encourage and spread Cool Britannia, riding on its coattails and getting support from a fair bunch of the young idols they were courting, including Oasis.
It's been a great year for British music. A year of creativity, vitality, energy, British bands storming the charts, British music back once again in its rightful place at the top of the world.
On the occasion of Labour's victory in May 1997, in a landslide so great that it was beyond even the party's most optimistic expectations, Noel Gallagher would be invited to 10 Downing Street for a music industry reception, despite fears that he might trash the place up. Alan McGee assured Tony Blair that things would be fine and Noel would behave, which indeed he did. He did say, however, that if Liam had been invited, well, things might have been a bit different. It was a crazy, crazy time. I cannot stress enough that Oasis were absolutely everywhere, and just about every detail of their lives was plastered all over the front page just about every day. What made them so popular? Who were they popular with? They were the flag bearer for the new British lad, of course. Everyone's cut off the stupid mullets they donned in the 80s and thrown away the garish leather bullshit, and they're not afraid to wear Ted Baker and Burberry, drink lager, have a cheeky line.
We had a good drink on the plane, it's safe to say. But we'd had a good guzzle up the night, and a good shovel up as well the night before. And we sort of carried on drinking Bloody Marys on the plane. Yeah. And we got off the plane and somebody handed us 2 cans of lager each and a fillet burger sandwich from Kentucky Fried Chicken. And I'm afraid the rest is down in celluloid TV history, I'm afraid.
The re-arrival of Paul Weller with stunning Back to the Roots albums like Stanley Road and Heavy Soul gave the new British lad a forefather, a direct link all the way back to the mods that they were closest to. And rest assured that there were plenty of bands coming up by now who were far more inspired by Oasis than they were by Blur. We'll get to them. Obviously, not everyone was enamoured with them, and you sure couldn't go far for opinions about the two brothers' knuckle-dragging antics, their status quo-like music, and their loutish, inconsiderate fans. But these voices were just drowned out by the crowd. The band themselves, on the other hand, were always seemingly in danger of implosion, and even if one brother was loving every minute, the other always had it in the back of their mind that they were the least likeliest rock stars in the history of the world. Don't want to be found out, do ya? And now, at last, we are ready to look at the third album, the subject of this bloody assize. That is quite enough of the wise, thank you very much.
And you fuck, I hope you all slip and bang your heads together, you old wankers.
Now, one pretty staggering thing about Oasis on their first two albums is how many tunes Noel seemed to have in the bag, and they were prepared to absolutely flood the charts with them. This was a time when indie bands in particular would really make the most out of their singles, with maxis and really strong B-sides being common. But even then, the fact that Oasis released songs like Acquiesce and The Master Plan on the other half of the records is pretty amazing. They were all part of the bag of songs that Noel had been holding since the early 90s, but come 1996, the bag was starting to run low, and there was going to have to be a bit of an interlude to fill it up, so to speak. Said interlude came in the spring and summer of 1996, when Noel and his then wife Meg took a couple of months' break in the island of Mustique. They stayed at Mick Jagger's villa, which also happened to be hosting Johnny Depp and his then wife Kate Moss, and he took the band's producer, Owen Morris, along for the ride. It was a relatively sedate time during which Noel and Owen happily got into something of a routine for writing or arranging the songs that would ultimately end up on Be Here Now, and if you listen to the Mustique demos, you can actually hear the makings of a pretty decent record.
Put myself under quite a bit of pressure because that was the only time that was set aside for writing. So when I went to Mustique, the first week was sort of quite slowish, and maybe wrote one, and then as soon as your mind was waking up, I was writing sort of 2 or 3 songs a day sometimes.
Unfortunately, because they were recorded on 8-track with a lot of overdubs and bouncers, a lot of the Mustique demos proved unusable in the final album because it was impossible to get rid of the drum machine. Still, listening to these demos might give you a bit more appreciation for the songs at least, listening to them before they went through the process of being utterly tortured. Anyway, the tour kicks back into gear. You have the coronation at Knebworth, the kerfuffles at Unplugged and the VMAs, and the band coming close to breaking up completely. It's a tricky time. And yet, with band relations at an all-time low, the decision is made to go straight into the studio and get working on the third album proper. Some have wondered whether this was the right thing to do. Maybe it would have been better to take the rest of 1996 off, recharge the batteries, build the bridges. But then a bitter and twisted, road-hardened band can sound a hell of a lot different to a band that spent the past couple of months counting money and not getting out of their pyjamas. They may be miserable as fuck, but ideally they'll be a bit more focused and tighter. That was the idea anyway. And so Oasis step off the stage and straight into the studio. And not just any studio, Abbey Road. It felt like they had to, really. Having enjoyed so many comparisons to the Beatles, positive and negative, it felt right to record in these hallowed halls. And yet the Abbey Road sessions proved to be a complete misery for all involved. First off, the paparazzi was all over every bit of it, being sure to mob the band and especially the brothers every morning on arrival and every evening on departure. These are the biggest celebs in the country that we're talking about after all. But in the end, Abbey Road simply didn't suit the band. It was almost too professional in environment, with opening and closing times, something that particularly didn't suit Noel, who often liked to work on songs through the night. There were even other people recording things like classical music in the next studio along who would suddenly knock on the door and ask Oasis to keep the noise down, even if the response to that would usually be laughter and scorn.
There's 3 studios in there, and we were playing that loud. Somebody knocked on the door one afternoon and told us could cook. Some old fellow, he was doing his flugelhorn overdub or something, and he came in and he's banging on his door and he says, "I'm awfully sorry, I've been." He said, "But I don't suppose you could turn it down a minute." He said, "I'm trying to do my flugelhorn downstairs." And we was like, "Flugelhorn? Stick your flugelhorn up your ass, mate. It's a recording studio."
Finally, it all came to a head when Liam got arrested and cautioned in November for cocaine possession after yet another bender. Cue more front page headlines and another bust-up. Recording was moved to the much more secluded surroundings of Ridge Farm in Surrey, where the band could happily work on the music at all hours without interruptions. Oh, and do cocaine. Lots of cocaine. Someone was asked on the first day to go score an ounce of weed, and they came back with an ounce of coke. And it pretty much just went on from there, really. Everyone, the whole band and the producer, was on Charlie. Even as Son spiralled out of control in an absolute blaze of overdub after overdub, there was nothing that could really stop it. The producer, Owen Morris, did try at times, but Noel would quickly cut him down, and so in Owen's words, he just resigned himself to shoveling more drugs up his nose. Hey, if you take enough of it, maybe the songs will start to sound good.
Feel good about your own, you know what I mean? It's like, if from your own point, you know what I mean? Surely someone's telling Michael Bolton he's great, you know what I mean? Right now, hey Michael, you're great. You know what I mean? And he's going, ah, yeah, cool, but he's a wanker, isn't he? You know what I mean?
Alan McGee had a look into the studio to see how the band were getting on one day and found mounds of powder everywhere, a session out of control, and some incredibly loud music indeed. It said that the band were using War Power by the Stooges as a template, which kinda tells you a lot. Fraternal relations had by this point seemed to improve a fair bit, with the brothers at least putting on a united front in public. In private, however, fights ensued just about every time Noel and Liam were together, and the two brothers recorded their respective guitar and vocal parts basically entirely separate from each other. A lot of the time they wouldn't even be in the studio on the same day. The endless overdubbing and snorting continued. Noel in particular wanted the record to sound, in his words, colossal, for the wall of sound to be more like a mountain. Owen Morris said that he thought the material was weak, and sure, Noel may have told him to fuck off, but doesn't all the endless layers of guitar kinda say something? Isn't it maybe hiding something? We'll get to that when we talk about the end product. Still, these were some of the most excess-laden recording sessions of all time, certainly when it came to good old cocaine. Everyone snorted an amount that would have put most 80s bands to shame. But still, the sessions were done. Not that we're close yet to actually reaching the album, there's the whole lead-in to it to go through. The infamous album cover photo shoot, for example, which ended up costing nearly 100 grand for a few photos. Mainly because, well, you know that the cover features a Rolls Royce inside a swimming pool? I bet you think that's photoshopped, don't you? It's not. It was actually Bonehead's idea, and the car is utterly real. It took 2 days to put the fucker in there. One cannot expect to do such things gratis. Oh yeah, and there was more drinking, more drugs, and more fights.
We put a white Rolls Royce in a swimming pool. The registration plate was blank, so somebody said, why don't we have the registration plate off the police van on Abbey Road? All of a sudden, it's like all over the press that they've actually got a story for every single item that's in this thing that took us like 5 minutes to throw it together. So let's just put that there.
Just a rock and roll cliche kind of album cover, isn't it? You know, Rolls Royce, scooter, the clock with no hands on it, what's that? What's that got to do with the Beatles? What's a lamppost got to do with the Beatles, you know what I mean? What's the swimming pool got to do with the Beatles? We like the Beatles, we like them, we love them. But I think it's an Oasis album, this one, I think we've got where we're going.
Anyway, the record is all mixed now and in the can. How do the band, Creation and Ignition, the band's personal management, choose to handle it? Well, they go for the secretive approach. They do so in a way that's almost close to parody, absolutely desperate to avoid any kind of leak whatsoever. Closer to the release, they gave a couple of songs to Radio 1 DJ Steve Lamacq to play as exclusives on the condition that he talk over them. He tried to, but after the show they appeared on, he was immediately told that he couldn't play them again because he hadn't talked over them enough. They had people often coming around the office to check everyone's phones because they were worried about them being tapped. That's not a joke. Even right up to the album's release, people were sent tracks with the condition that they could not talk about it to anyone, not even their wives. The same level of secrecy was being applied to this bloody album as you might have expected would be applied to the frickin' nuclear codes. And while this increased the hype surrounding the album to utterly insane levels, a lot of people have said that in retrospect, it was absolutely ridiculous what they were doing. But eventually, the big day comes. August 21st, 1997. Be Here Now hits the shelves. And before we talk about the reception of it or anything, it's only fair that we finally review the damn thing.
I just hope the people who buy it like it. I hope the people who buy it like it tell their mates. I hope their mates tell their mates. Because they need to build another car park for that helicopter.
Everyone's very excited, and all the band, everyone who works for it is excited to get back out again.
Shoes excite me, Lager excites me, America excites me, stools excite me, Everything excites me. I'm just one excited young man.
For a ballad, it just seems so claustrophobic. From here, the album kind of finishes off with another couple of toothless ballads that mistake blandness for bliss. Unfortunately, the album doesn't really stick the landing, nor did the flow up until this point keep me on the edge of my seat.
What can I say? Nothing personal. Anyway, that's how long the album is. It goes right up to the very edge of the disc. Comparatively, Morning Glory and Definitely Maybe are a relatively lean 50 minutes. Hell, that's still short enough that you could fit both of those albums onto single LPs, but not so here. But the cumulative length of the album isn't what makes Be Here Now so long, as much as it is the length of the songs themselves. If you don't count the final song, a reprise of one of the other tracks, only 2 of the songs are under 5 minutes long. Most of them are in the 6 to 7 minute range, and the longest of the lot clocks in at 9 minutes and 19 seconds. Oasis had a couple of long songs up to this point, but their only real epic was Champagne Supernova from the last record, which has rightly gone down as one of their classics. And so, here's an album utterly chock full of that. Now, it's only fair for me to start with the positives. There are 3 songs on the album that I enjoy unreservedly. I Hope, I Think I Know is the shortest proper song on the record and one of the heaviest and fastest that Oasis have ever done. It's loud, brash and punky. Again, they were apparently listening to raw power of all records a lot of the time. This and My Big Mouth, another rambunctious blast that really should have opened the record, I felt, are the 2 songs where I can buy that. Both get a thumbs up from me, especially I Hope, I Think I Know. We also have Fade In Out, which is, for me, the only long song on the record that justifies its length. You've got a solid riff, one of Liam's best ever vocal performances. He's laying into the song in a way that you'd rarely find even in the band's glory days, and it's brilliant. And you've even got some corking slide guitar provided by, of all people, Johnny Depp, which was recorded back in Mystique. I really like this song, and you know, I can even forgive its meandering outro, which kind of feels like a college band's half remembered take on The End by The Doors. These 2 songs are thoroughly approved, and, you know, I suppose that Don't Go Away, one of the shorter and more contemplative moments on the record, is thoroughly inoffensive and not really worthy of scorn. As for the rest, well, let's have a look, shall we? The opening track is also the lead-in single and one of their most famous songs, Do You Know What I Mean? As a title, it's almost perfect. It feels like the band taking the piss out of themselves, even. This is a song title you'd expect a parody of Oasis to come up with, and now they're doing it. Cool. Unfortunately, you then hear the song and realise that it's kind of deadly serious. A 7.5 minute drag based on a slowed down drum loop from NWA Straight Outta Compton, it uses every trick in the book in order to make the song anthemic. Now, Oasis often used sound effects, kind of another Beatles thing I suppose, in songs, but you kind of have to be careful doing such things, and Be Here Now is where it gets really cheesy. You've got planes, helicopters, Morse code, backwards voices, and that's before the thing even starts. It's annoying, especially considering that on Mystique the song is actually decent. It's still long, but there's actually a build-up to it. There isn't really build-up in this final version because everything is so damn loud and compressed. Even the verses are so layered and overdubbed to hell that by the time the big chorus does come along, you're already feeling a bit battered. There's no actual release in the fucker. And after a couple of rounds of this, the song just descends into even more overdubs, peppered with Noel guitar licks and solos in kind of a Wayne's World style. It's just nonsense, really. The video, a hugely expensive shit show filled with helicopters and whatnot, again, almost makes you think it could be parody until you realise that, no, this is actually serious. All my people, right here, right now, do you know what I mean? It's like they're trying to create a slogan, an iconic statement, something to really sum up the time, yeah? It doesn't work. A very frustrating song that could have been more. If you want an example of that, head to the 20th anniversary remaster of the album and check out Noel's 2016 Rethink version. Suddenly it's a much fuller song, there's dynamics, you get to hear the booming strings that were utterly lost in the original. This is a good song, but it's killed by the production. And really, it should have been the track 3 and definitely not the opener. Now, I'm going to be honest and say that I could copy and paste that summary of Do You Know What I Mean for a lot of the songs on the record. It certainly applies to the likes of The Girl in the Dirty Shirt, the title track, or the album closing It's Getting Better Man. The trouble with all of these songs is that there is absolutely a good song inside of them. If you listen to Mustique, you may well find it. But the trouble is, it's twofold. Firstly, a lot of the songs are too long. Do You Know What I Mean would be a great 4 to 5 minute song, but there isn't nearly enough ideas for it to be stretched to 7.5, okay, Noel? You may well layer 40 guitars on the thing, but that doesn't matter if you've only got one real riff, and the stretching just feels so artificial. And that's the second problem, too many cooks. To use a tortured food metaphor, the first 2 albums are cheese and red onion chutney sandwiches. 3 things that are utterly awesome together. For the 3rd album, add to this noble mixture some Branston pickle, English mustard, Hellman's mayo, peanut butter and a smidgen of strawberry jam, and take a bite. Whatever good was in the base of the whole thing has now been utterly ruined by a load of unnecessary shit. Why are so many of the songs this sway though? Well, things had changed between the 2nd and 3rd album. After Definitely Maybe, they were big enough for arenas. After Morning Glory, they were big enough for stadiums. Ultimately, they were big enough for frickin' Knebworth. Knebworth, those 250,000 people or whatever, is their peak when it comes to success. But in terms of songwriting, they became almost beholden to it. There's a great need for just about every song on this record to be anthemic, to be super long and have that massive chorus everyone can shout along to because, well, it's just what you do, innit? Every song essentially needs to be ready-made for another Knebworth. All the subtlety and intimacy is lost. With every record it feels like the band gets further and further away. Definitely Maybe felt like you were right in front of them in a sweaty club. What's the Story was still fine. You were standing in the middle of an arena, bouncing around with everyone else. But Be Here Now, you're right at the back of a massive field, you can't see for the raised hands and cigarette lighters, and if you really squint, one of the dots up ahead might just be Liam. You'd still probably be able to clearly see the shine off of Bonehead's scalp though. Any other lowlights? Well, there's Noel's vocal turn, Magic Pie. His turn on the previous record, Don't Look Back in Anger, is one of the band's most famous songs. Sure, it's essentially one of his biggest shots at being John Lennon with the Imagine piano and all that, but it does work. This, on the other hand, nah, not having it. The utterly unnecessary feedback wails, the silly vocal effects, and again, it's probably good enough for 4 minutes, but is double the length of that. And an utterly undeserving track 3 to boot. Stand By Me, the 2nd single, is one of the more straight-ahead songs on the record, but that doesn't mean that it isn't basically a complete rip-off of Motley Hoople's All the Young Dudes, with again, none of the charm and twice the length. You can find a slightly better Noel-led take of this on the Mustique session, but honestly, it's just a bad song. It's Getting Better Man, well, it could have been good if it wasn't for the absolute shit production. I mean, do you know when people talk about the loudness war? This is what they mean. Everything is overly loud and compressed to shit, there's no dynamics, and it's virtually unlistenable. A hideous, trebly mess, and a real kick in the balls as the last proper song on the album. And then, of course, there's All Around the World. Oh boy. The longest song in Oasis's catalogue, a 9+ minute monster, the centrepiece of the album, and its utter nadir. The short and pithy way to describe it is Oasis's most blatant and failed attempt at aping the Beatles. In this example, they're trying to do Hey Jude. All of the stuff about anthemic songs that I've said for the other songs on the record, you can double, triple maybe for this song in particular. It makes the others look like a throwaway music hall shuffle by comparison. Quite frankly, you know you're in trouble when only 3 minutes in, the na-na-na-nas start, and there are still 6 minutes remaining. Cue the overdubs, the strings that you just cannot hear, and not 1, not 2, but 3 truck drivers' gear changes. You know, a term for a stinking, utterly obvious and unsubtle key change that you'd expect to find in a fucking Westlife record. It's sound and fury signifying utterly nothing, the definition of an unspeakably atrocious song. Now, this is not a controversial opinion. When people think of Be Here Now, they often think of this song. It was one of the singles, after all. And like Do You Know What I Mean, it hit #1, the longest song to ever do so, by the way. A lot of people say that if one song defines the utter excess of the record, the amount of coke that went into it, the band's sudden shortage of good songs and ideas and all that, It's this one. After all, the only way you could appreciate it is if you were on as much Charlie as they were. However, surprisingly, the song predates the album by several years. In fact, it was written as early as 1992. Noel always had this massive vision for the song, complete with 36-piece orchestra and all of that, and he purposefully kept it aside until the vision could be realised. It was his baby, I suppose. But, I mean, if there is ever a song that anyone was too close to, it's probably this. Even the Mystique demo doesn't reveal a good song that's hiding within. It's still the same ultra-anthemic bullshit with utterly inane teeny bopper lyrics. Just, you know, with less overdubs and, I think, one less gear change. Noel thought it was his great epic, his magnum opus, right up to the time that the Fin was released, even if as a songwriter he'd already moved past it many times over. The previous big and long Oasis songs, the likes of Slide Away and Champagne Supernova, all-time classics both, came after this song, not before. This song really should have just stayed in the bag. And short of a closing orchestral reprise of All Around the World to remind you of the great song that you absolutely and utterly did not just hear, and it's basically only there as one final insult to keep you from pressing stop on the record and rushing to the toilet before you piss yourself, having caused an unnecessary strain on your bladder by forcing yourself to get through the whole bastard thing in one uninterrupted sitting, that's Be Here Now. It's not a good record. It wasn't good then, and time has not been kind to it. You will get the odd piece wondering if it's really that bad, especially around its 20th anniversary last year, but honestly, it's pretty shit. It's not all shit. Again, there are a couple of decent songs. If you're really patient and forgiving, you might be able to pick out the good parts in the songs that fall victim to the steam hammer production and the carpet bomb overdubs. And you know what? It wouldn't be difficult to keep the best songs from the record and replace the rest with the best from the Mystique sessions, solid B-sides like Stay Young and Going Nowhere, and demos like the beautiful If We Shadows, and make your own Be Here Now that's just as good as the first two albums. But what we did get was a thoroughly self-indulgent and overworked record indeed. It was more than just a bad album, it was the album that stopped Oasis in their tracks. And it cut short their ambitions of being the world's biggest band. And here's why. A simple look at the sales numbers would make you think that Be Here Now was a success story. Even though the label foregone a midnight launch due to, yet again, concerns about information on the album being leaked and initial sales in the morning were slow, Be Here Now still ended up selling 424,000 copies on its very first day, and a grand total of 696k in the first week, enough to make it the fastest selling album in the history of the British charts, a mark that's only been eclipsed by Adele's 25, which sold a staggering 800,307 copies in 2015. However, Adele's album released on a Monday. The really staggering thing about Oasis's sales is that Be Here Now was released on a Thursday. The 696,000 from its first chart week was sold in a mere 3 days.
Right, they've got the new Oasis album.
Be Here Now, their eagerly awaited third album, hit the record shops today. At the lads' local store Sifters, business was booming. The shop is already a favourite with the band.
We were mentioned in Shaker Maker, it's going back a bit now, actually about 3 years ago. We've got a line in it. Mr. Sifter sold me songs when I was just 16. Now he stops at traffic lights, but only when they're green.
The album would go on to sell over 8 million copies worldwide, and it was the biggest selling UK album of 1997. And actually, you might be surprised by how low that mark is, considering that first week of sales. To draw out the Adele comparison, 25, which still technically broke Oasis's record, is currently sitting at over 22 million worldwide sales, which is the same ballpark figure that's given for Oasis's biggest album, What's the Story Morning Glory. Be Here Now didn't come close to that in the end. But we'll get into that. Singles-wise, there were 3 of them. Both Do You Know What I Mean and All Around the World went to #1 in the UK. Stand By Me would have undoubtedly also been #1, but it so happened to be eclipsed by the second biggest selling single of all time, Elton John's Candle in the Wind 97, released in tribute to Princess Diana. All 3 were accompanied by Oasis's highest concept and most expensive videos to date, a jam in a war-torn setting with coloured smoke grenades and tons of helicopters, a narrative video that's shown in backwards, and a near 10-minute bash about with 1 million references to 60s psychedelia. What follows are the highlighted thoughts of Noel Gallagher on these videos a little over 20 years later, taken from the audio commentary for Oasis's Time Flies DVD set.
What's this now? Oh, well, now, this is where it gets... This is fucking... What's coming up now is 7.5 minutes of... This is... Look, Griggs looks like he's going to the bookies. I look like I'm going to football. Bonehead looks like he's going to the bookies. Alan looks like he's going skiing. And our kid has just come back off manoeuvres in fucking the Outer Hebrides somewhere. I mean, the unlikeliest bunch of rock stars you've ever seen in your fucking life. Now, I don't know where all these people are going, or where they've come from, or why they're running even, or why they're all dressed in camouflage. When Paul Weller first seen this video, he described it as, yeah, seen your fucking video yesterday. I said, yeah, what do you reckon? And he said, yeah, it's fucking apocalypse yesterday. Is this real? Is this a real video? Yeah, I'm not having any of this. Is this leading up to something? Have you seen this video?
It's all backwards.
Oh. Right, pity the song is. That might have sounded a bit more interesting. I have to say, with all these videos, if you need 4 guys to walk around in slow motion, we were the fucking... We were the best at that. Maybe the motorbike's rushing to the radio station to say, stop! This is shit! If anybody's listening to this at home, you'd be advised to probably go and fucking mow the garden or something, because this goes on for ages. And ages. They are really ill-fitting suits as well, aren't they? Fucking hell. And I bet they cost a fucking fortune. Robbie Williams based his entire fucking career on this song. That's what I hate about this. Is that a man with legs made of sausages? That's not real. Someone's having a fucking... I know for a fact that's got nothing to do with this song. A man with legs made of sausages. What about pigs don't fly and never say die? That's surely... Somebody... Why didn't somebody fucking stop me at that point and say, let's just... He's gone on holiday.
What about the press though? When it came to a largely very well regarded album like What's the Story, they'd been dismissive towards it. Here though, the result was the opposite. Be Here Now was praised to the absolute high heavens. Seriously, almost every review of the album in the major magazines was staggeringly effusive with praise. Select led their review with the line, "And on the third album, Noel created rock," before calling it the finest sound in the world. Uncut took Noel's recent statement that Oasis were bigger than God, another attempt to one-up Lennon, at face value in their 5-star review. Melody Maker said it rocked like a bastard, Mojo said it had masterpiece written all over it, the NME got experts in to say that it would make them the biggest band in the world. Even the internet's busiest music nerds circa 1997, Pitchfork Media, liked it, and they barely liked anything that wasn't written by Tom York. But the most infamous review of them all was Q's, which basically presented it as one of the greatest albums ever made. It ends by saying that with Be Here Now, Oasis are doing what the Beatles did, taking the sole responsibility of cheering the country up and doing a handsome job of it. Yes, with Be Here Now. The album that's 71.5 minutes of teeth-chattering, excessive swallowing, hog-snorting drivel, recorded largely by 2 people who at best despised each other. Just about anyone with a working pair of ears can tell that Be Here Now is at best a seriously flawed record. Even the very kindest readings of the album make note that there are a lot of things that could have been done differently.
At the lads' local pub, they weren't too impressed with the new single.
The whole where we came from. You know, the whole that they're on about, it's like referring to Burnies where we live. I mean, they are Burnies lads at the end of the day.
But musically, they think Oasis have done Burnage proud, especially the song Stand By Me.
I thought it was brilliant. Yeah, he's got the voice for it. He has.
So why was there so much praise for the album? Why were they all saying that this, one of the most hyped albums ever, lived up to the hype? 2 reasons perhaps. The first is a little sinister. It's certainly possible that Oasis's label and management were putting pressure on the mags to review the album well. They'd seen how they'd treated Morning Glory, and they didn't like it. Would be a real shame if Oasis decided they didn't want to appear in your mags anymore, wouldn't it? Especially seeing as they are worth their weight in gold when it comes to column inches and circulation. It is possible to read between the lines in some of the reviews and see some of the faults laid out. Coke is mentioned, as is excess, as is it being a little samey, and very loud and trebly indeed. You can find it all amongst the grander statements of praise. There is another explanation though, that the mags just didn't want to be as utterly out of step with public opinion as they were with What's the Story. What with all the hype and the Knebworth and everything else, Be Here Now was obviously going to be massive. Publicly, Alan McGee was predicting 20 million sales, even if privately he thought that 7 was the album's limit. The people absolutely loved Oasis, and the press perhaps thought that by this point Noel and Liam could have recorded 74 minutes of them pissing, snorting and shitting, and the public would have lapped it up. So, you know, give the people what they want, in other words. And yet, well, the public weren't given a lot of credit. It turned out that, a couple of months or so in, the press were utterly out of step with the British public again. Once the songs were fully out there, the reaction on the street to Be Here Now was, well, yeah. That it was overbearing, loud, overlong, and barely accessible. It didn't capture the imagination like Morning Glory did. It sounded like a band huffing and puffing. It sounded knackered, which is what the press had said about the second album. The band, the management, the press tried everything in their power to make this record a seminal British classic, but it just wouldn't take in the slightest. More than that, Be Here Now was supposed to be the Britpop record, the definitive statement for a generation that Britpop was here now and here to stay. Instead, Be Here Now would be the record that was largely charged with killing Britpop, at least as a huge commercial movement that at one point seemed like it was going to take over the world. Why? What happened? A few things perhaps. One of them is timing, the sort of which you can't possibly predict. 10 days after the release of Be Here Now, Princess Diana died in a car accident and the nation was plunged into mourning. How much of an effect did that have? For all the coke, drink and fights, Oasis are not in any way a depressive band. Be Here Now is still a pretty raucous and cheerful record in the end. And suddenly, it didn't fit in with the times so much. People might have looked towards darker efforts, and they would find them in some of the other popular indie music of the time, including that from Britpop's other cornerstones. Blur's self-titled album recoiled away from the overt Britishness of The Great Escape, looking more towards American college rock like Pavement, getting a little bit into heroin, and producing a much darker record than anything they'd done previously. You've got OK Computer by Radiohead, who were never really part of the Britpop scene at all. Critically adored, experimental and dark. Everything that Oasis hated and stood against.
And they're just miserable. They're sitting in back of limousines, you know, to tell to the camera about how bored they are being in a group. It's like, well, if you don't fucking enjoy it, retire, do us all a fucking favour, you know, and go and live in a fucking mansion in Oxford so we don't have to listen to your miserable fucking bleatings about how shit your life is. Yes. You know. Now,
the Verve's Urban Hymns, another smash, was perhaps a bit less dour than their earlier work, meaning that Richard Ashcroft might have cracked a half smile for all the tears. They had their own anthems, but they had a much harder edge than Noel's. And while it's a few months later, Pulp's This Is Hardcore is basically the record for the Britpop come down. Nothing cheerful about it, the happy-go-lucky sound of Common People and Disco 2000 skewered and transported to a sullen handjob in a dingy provincial nightclub. All of these things aside, the main case against Be Here Now is still that it was clearly a massive disappointment, both for the general public and even for a lot of fans of the band. Oasis, as it turned out, were in a much more precarious position than they thought they were. Through the whirlwind first couple of years, their reputation was based not just on the rockstar antics, but on Noel's tunes. He had so many great ones in the bag that he was immediately proclaimed to be an infallible, genius songwriter. And Be Here Now showed him up, big time. Not that any human could possibly have maintained such a high standard, but that was the big cornerstone that Oasis were based on, and when it cracked, the image of the band fell apart. Noel was right back in 1994. It really was all about the music. Even those who wear sunglasses indoors and can't quite escape the age still feel the disappointment, all these years later.
I think I was a mug to buy it. The most overhyped album of all time. I travelled up to London on the day of its release and bought it. and I got it home and I thought, what the fuck is this shit? The whole success thing got to Oasis and mixed up with cocaine, and their egos were well overblown. Funny actually, I remember hearing the lead track and I thought, yeah, it was alright. It's all the rest of the stuff. It's Magic Pie and Stand By Me. I mean, Stand By Me, I mean, obviously it goes on, drones on, and Stand By Me, Stand By, you know. That's what I think of it. I think it was the Nail in the Coffin, yes. Some people say Oasis performing at Knebworth was what killed Britpop a year before. However, I would always point out that Blur put out a fairly decent album in early 1997. Songs, you know, with Beetlebum and Song 2 on it, and those were decent songs. But yeah, I think Be Here Now. It was the nail in the coffin.
Naturally, backlash ensued. People suddenly had a lot less time for the rockstar antics and were a lot more candid about trashing their music. The critical U-turn for them that greeted the release of Be Here Now was followed by another critical U-turn against them mere months later, as the same magazines who praised the record began to treat it as overhyped and overrated. It was reported in 1999 that Be Here Now was the one album that could be found more easily than any other in second-hand stores across the country. Clearly a fair few people hadn't even wanted to keep it in their collection, let alone their CD player. If Oasis still presided over Britpop, whatever that was now was an utterly fragmented and broken scene. The bands who followed them didn't so much take influence from them as entirely ape their style, the likes of Embrace, Starsailor and Hurricane No. 1, all of whom were usually treated with utter scorn by everyone from the music press to the very band they were imitating, even if some of their records did sell.
It's how you write it, you know what I mean? I'm not into writing fucking morbid music like the rest of these pricks that are playing here. They all write bollocks, you know what I mean? They're all like fucking... They're all in pain. Well, my fucking ears are in pain, fucking hearing your fucking voice, you twat. You know what I mean? You're right, you know, music should be a fucking uplifting thing.
Carry on.
So I've got to ask you, what happened with James from Starsailor?
I don't know, you know. I was just, you know, being there, trying to act like, you know, peace and love to all men and all that, and then he comes up and he taps me on the shoulder. I don't like it. So when I walked over...
over to Liam.
So I walked over and I says, yeah, come here. I says, you ever interrupt anyone's interview again and you'll be going on in an ambulance? And you're lucky that I'm going on stage in about 3 minutes' time because I'd be chasing you down there like some mad wolf. So then, if I'd have come off stage, and obviously they weren't there when we come off.
Stay out of my fucking way.
In the glory days of Britpop, it was said that any bunch of fuckers with instruments, mop tops and Adidas could form a band and 3 weeks later be featured on the front cover of NME. Come the end of 1997, this was no longer the case. The world of Britpop was closing its doors. Oasis, in a way, were closing their doors too. When All Around the World was released as a single in March 1998, it kinda took on a different tone to the all-encompassing effort that was first heard on the album. Those last cries, the I Know What I Knows and It's Gonna Be OK's, almost sounded like mantras of reassurance as they were forced off of the main stage. And sure enough, it would be okay. It's not like Oasis didn't have a big fan base still, one that would completely secure them for the next decade and beyond, one that would be enough to secure a few more #1s purely from their fans buying up the records. But they wouldn't be able to reach everybody like they did before. Their fan base in the US dwindled pretty quickly following Be Here Now, reducing the band to largely a British concern outside of tours. Oasis kinda became like a cult, a band and a group of fans who were interested in them and not a whole lot else. They were now the best since band. Every new record would be a return to form, or the best since What's the Story, even if it clearly wasn't much better or worse than whatever mediocrity had come before it. They were compared to other big bands in similar situations, like Iron Maiden, or most often Status Quo. Something about Oasis just seems to fit. The only difference is just how fast all of this happened. Definitely Maybe was released in 1994. This is 1998 we're still talking about. 4 years, and Oasis were already a legacy band. Is that harsh? In some ways, yeah. It's not like Noel or the band wouldn't ever write a decent song again. Sure, some of the following records are way worse than Be Here Now. Their next one, Standing on the Shoulder of Giants, was quite frankly diabolical, but you would get a good tune from them now and again. It was just clear that they'd failed in their stated ambition to be the biggest band in the world. They came mighty close, but fell at the final hurdle. Noel would treat Be Here Now with utter disdain in the years to come, saying that it was the sound of a bunch of guys in the studio, on coke, not giving a fuck. The backbone of the band, while always in the background, also departed. Bonehead and Grigsby left before the next album was out. And yet, they left. They weren't sacked. Seems like both of them simply decided that they'd had enough of the wide. And while neither were essential to the band, the members that followed them weren't usually treated like anything more than session musicians. As for Liam, well, naturally he disagrees with Noel and still says to this day that Be Here Now's great. The Oasis show would continue for just over another decade, complete with all the antics, the usual songs, and all the fights until finally, one fracas between the brothers in 2009 fatally wounded the band and broke them up. Nowadays, Liam and Noel concentrate on solo projects for a still sizable audience. But again, it could have been much more. And well, that's it pretty much. So why make this video anyway? The Britpop times were my childhood, and these years were like a freaking whirlwind. The time when you get into music, and this was what was playing all the time. Honestly, Oasis were far from my favourite Britpop band. I was and still am much more into Pulp, or Blur. In fact, it hasn't been until the making of this video, suggested by a very dear Oasis fan indeed, that I've managed to find a bit of an appreciation for their music that I never really had before. This series is all about big rises and falls, definitive events and all of that. And there are few times like this where you get so many events and such a big rise and fall packed into such a short time as there were with this ridiculous bunch of Manx. Oasis were, perhaps for the last time, the sound of the British coming to take over the world once again, to recreate the empire in media, until inevitably it all fell apart. But damn it if the fuckers didn't try. The community gives thanks to the following: Adam Schaefer, Alex Stocco, Andrew Dalton, Andy Capt, Audie Sawley, Conformist, Daniel Briggs, Daniel David Taylor, Dustin Cooper, Gary Pinkett, George Newton, Ghostly Spectre, Guatham Blackpool, Hunter, Ian Roberts, James Idd, James Loveridge, Jason Durso, Jason Goy, Jason Leach, Jason Stevens, Johan Eriksson, Josh Jensen, Lee Norris, Mark Johnston, Martin Pataki, Morten Skanin, Nanette McCrone, Nicholas Tristan, Olaf Albeen, Peter Jack, Peter Sidorn, Phil Taprog, Pocky Southmaid, Rachel Maxwell, Romeo, Ryan Burford, Sammy Lee, Scott Coulter, Sean Zoltek, Seth Robinson, Simon Gulliver, Stephen Warner, The Unnatural, Tanyo J, Yucca Operator, and Zach Roach.